Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome from me. I'm Maitrikumara, and welcome as well if you're watching at home. So, like Akasha Mitra said, this evening we're starting a new series of talks on a Tibetan Buddhist figure, who's on the shrine here, Milarepa. So, Milarepa is sort of a sort of ancient Tibetan sort of Buddhist figure, sort of Tibet's sort of most famous saint, sort of yogi, saint, and sort of also sort of spiritual poet, if you like. So I might talk a little bit about Milarepa and then go on to, one of the stories about Milarepa. Milarepa, it's like I say, he sort of goes back, I think it's around the 11th century, something like that, 11th century. And, he's a figure that is both historical and also sort of mythical. So it's one of those figures that the stories about Milarepa and his life story is sort of both sort of historical events and sort of, I think there's even places you can visit which would be like what caves he meditated in or towers he's built. Maybe we'll get to those towers at some point in one of the talks. Also the stories are also sort of mixed with sort of beautiful imagery and sort of magic, a lot of magic. Just to say a little bit about this figure, and I think we'll probably just say a little bit about Milarepa each week and then go on to one of the stories about him. And he's from when he's growing up, he's from a wealthy background, a wealthy family. But when his father dies, his inheritance is he's sort of robbed out of his inheritance, or cheated out of his inheritance, him and his mother, by his aunt and uncle. And so they basically live for many years, sort of like working as slaves, if you like, on the land and for the wealth that they should have inherited. And so it's a very rough story. I'm just going to very quick sort of story. His mother encourages him or sort of tells him to go and learn dark magic. Which is sort of a thing in ancient Tibet. You can go and learn dark magic. And so he goes out to find someone to teach him dark magic. And he finds someone, he learns, and in sort of revenge, he takes revenge on his aunt and uncle. He conjures up, what he learns to do is he can conjure hailstorms. So he conjures up these hailstorms. And he kills his aunt and uncle and many other people. I think in the life story it's like 36 or 37 people. Now his sort of start of his life is sort of quite a dark tale, and it's sort of his mind and his life is about revenge, really, about taking revenge. But he, once taking revenge, feels sort of a great remorse and a great sadness, and also he feels a great sort of fear because he knows that he's committed these evil deeds, and what would be common belief there is that he's bound for a very bad rebirth, and so he needs to go. What he wants to do is find a teacher and practice Dharma and commit his life to the spiritual life, practicing Dharma. So he goes forth and finds a teacher, and his teacher sends him through sort of lots of a really no-nonsense, very hard teacher. Gets him to go through all sorts of sort of difficult tasks. Like I said, one of his tasks is he orders him to sort of build him these towers. And then when he's finished building these towers, after months of building a tower, he said, I didn't want it there, knock it down, I want it over there. Sort of stories like that. And then he'll build that tower and he goes, no, that's the wrong something or other, knock it down and start again. he would sort of put him through these things, really sort of tough practice, because he knew what sort of evil sort of deeds or weighty karma he had, sort of what weighty evil karma, what would have thought of in those times as weighty evil karma, and he needs to sort of burn it up or something like that. So what this teacher does, so it's sort of like a very strict, harsh teacher called Marpa, but also all of that is coming from a place of love, because he wants to, all of that is coming from a place to help Milarepa. And what he gets Milarepa to do, to deepen his practice, to keep going with his practice, is to go out into mountain vast mountain sort of retreats. So to go into a mountain range and find a cave in solitude and practice meditation there, just so he can single-mindedly practice meditation. Like I say, myth and history put together. And so this is sort of where we find Milarepa. So you can see the image on the shrine, and he's I really like this image, we were just looking at it earlier. He looks quite human in this image. Sometimes the image is a bit more mythical, and you might find him sort of like a green figure, more like a green colour. And that's supposed to be because he lives just in solitude all the time, and all he eats is nettles. He has like hard nettles, and then sometimes he has nettle soup. And so the nettles have turned his skin green. And so sometimes you see him as sort of green. But in this picture, what I like is sort of he's just sort of, his skin's all sort of dirty and his robes are really dirty. He's sort of in a cave as well, and it sort of, I think, sort of captures this human side of like what it looked like, this sort of man off in lonely mountain retreats in caves, just practicing meditation day in, day out. So you can read about the life story. There's a life story of Milarepa, which I think was written a couple centuries later after he died, but there's a life story of Milarepa which sort of gives the whole plot of that. And then after that, there are books called The 100,000 Songs of Milarepa. So one thing that Milarepa does is also, like I say, he's a poet, and as he starts to progress, eventually becomes an enlightened figure, an enlightened Buddhist, and goes on to teach the Dharma to people. And the way he teaches is through song. So he would get sort of feel, I don't know, in the stories, and there's the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa, this text, which is about that big. There aren't actually 100,000, it's just like, it's just, they didn't count, and it's roughly 100, no, it's just it's supposed to be, a big number. And the 100,000 songs, and they're sort of these stories of sort of things happening to Milarepa, or little tales, or encounters. A lot of it is encounters with people, and sort of things will happen, and then he sort of will burst into song, and in the song are his sort of dharmic teachings. So you sort of get these stories are like sort of a lot of it sort of like in verse form of him singing these songs to his disciples, or just on his own. Sort of when he feels dharmic inspiration, he sort of bursts out into song. And so we're going to start with a story tonight. It's sort of the first story. Actually, it's only the first couple of pages of his big text of 100,000 songs. The first story of Milarepa, and this is where we find him, basically. So he's not an enlightened being, and his teacher, in order to get him to deepen his practice and really practice sort of uncompromisingly, sent him into mountains to find a cave to meditate in, to live in and meditate in. So that's where we find Milarepa now. And the story goes that Milarepa is in his cave meditating, and there's a storm starting to brew outside. So he goes to, and he realizes he hasn't got many sticks to make a fire. During his time meditating, he's neglected his store of sticks of wood, so he has to go out and find some wood. So in this image, he's sort of quite well robed, but in the 100,000 Songs, he just has a little bit of cloth. He has just like this small white bit of cloth which he wears, I guess, around there, and that's all he has. Later on, he sort of doesn't even have anything. He sort of renounces all clothing. We don't have an image of that on the shrine. So he goes out and he has this cloth, and he goes to gather sticks to make this fire. And he's gathering the sticks, but the wind is blowing, and he's trying to gather sticks, and the wind, the storm, which is picking up, is blowing off, blowing his garment, his cloth off him. And so he's trying to hold on to that, and then he's dropping the sticks. And so he's sort of picking up his sticks and dropping and then trying to hold on to the cloth. And then he gets a moment of, so he's sort of like grabbing onto that, dropping his sticks, grabbing his sticks. And then he has a moment of sort of realization, and he sort of thinks, what am I holding on to here? What am I clinging to, and what am I grabbing onto here? And he sort of has, it's almost like a bit of self-respect or something. So you've been practicing meditation for all these years, all this time. And he says, I'm still clinging to my ego. So that's his realization. He said, after all this time, I've still got ego clinging. So what he does is sort of like battling against this wind. So he just lets go of everything. And in that moment, because he hasn't been eating, and because he just realizes like, oh gosh, I've been meditating, I haven't been eating. He's very weak and frail, and he lets go of everything. And in that moment, the storm is so strong, and he sort of passes out. So that's the story so far. That's the little tale. The book that we're going to be talking from, or sort of basing these talks around, are lectures from, or rather seminars, which are sort of in book form by our teacher, Bhante Sangharakshita. And the book's called The Yogi's Joy. And the book is in the bookshop, so you can look at that later. And it's just from this little story, and it's full of richness, and I'm just going to go into a little bit of it. So Bhante Sangharakshita just goes into so much just from these few paragraphs. He sort of goes into a whole chapter really of richness and what we can get from that. The first thing I like is this sort of image, of him. I also have 100,000 Songs for books. It's partly kind of unreadable. It's quite hard to read. I mean, a lot of it, it's sort of, ancient Tibetan stories and landscapes and settings. But actually, also, it's not unreadable. It's quite difficult to get into. But actually, it's really quite enjoyable once you get into it. I actually really enjoy reading it now that I sort of got into how it's written. And some of it's actually quite funny, like some of the disciples and the encounters he's had was very amusing. And I quite like this image of of him like sort of trying to pick up one thing and then dropping the other, and then sort of getting frustrated. It sort of reminds me of I do it all the time. You get your jumper, if you get like a baggy jumper and you get it like caught on the door handle or something like that. And it's like, the one thing that came to mind was when I got I got a quite expensive new jumper and a brand new backpack, and I thought, new stuff, new jumper, new backpack, ready for, new year, new me. And this new backpack had this Velcro flap on it, really strong because it was a good backpack, and I immediately got the knitted jumper. First time I got it out on that, ripped it off and just did all the threads on the jumper. And what I did in response to that was get really angry at the backpack, or I get really angry at the jumper I'm wearing, or I get really angry at the door. Like, who would make a backpack with such a strong Velcro grip all those sort of like cursing and taking it out on those objects. And so Milarepa gets in one of those situations, and for him it turns into a moment of insight. For him, he doesn't get frustrated and like get, this silly wind, this silly cloth, these silly sticks. For him, it turns into a moment of insight, and what he sees is this sort of root delusion. What Buddhism would say is our sort of root delusion, our root way of interpreting to the world, that he's got this separate self, this ego, this idea of a separate self, interacting with a fixed separate self, interacting with a world out there that's just fixed. So this moment turns into a sort of moment of insight for him. So I think this talk's entitled something about ego clinging, letting go of ego clinging, something, and I think that's quite a common word now. People, I don't know, with psychology and things, it's like people, if you sort of like this idea of having a sort of a fixed and separate self, and what would I say about that? It's this sort of idea of a separate self in Buddhism, which sort of is for us, not for us, for everyone, is sort of what we would say is the Buddha would say, or Buddhism would say, is the root of all our suffering. So it's a root delusion that we sort of exist as we're sort of like, sort of our default factory setting of looking at the world is that we're sort of the main character in sort of a film, and everyone we sort of meet are sort of side parts, and also that I think that one of the key words is fixed and unchanging. So we start to identify with things that we've got, so either possessions or status or looks or appearance. We say, like, I don't know, we have a certain hairstyle, and like, oh yeah, this is me, we don't say that, but we might think, lower down, deeper down. And we sort of don't, so we think we're sort of fixed, and we think we're separate, and that's not quite, and that's not, the Buddha would say, or Buddhism would say, that that's sort of a deluded way of looking at the world. And we sort of know rationally that that's not true, definitely not fixed. Like, we know that we're all aging. We know that one day we're going to die, and those we love will die, and the possessions we have will one day belong to someone else. Those things that we hold so dear and cling to, and sort of call me, mine, this is who I am, this is what defines me. But we don't live out like that. So on a rational level, we'd say we know that, but how we interact with the world is very differently. We interact as if we are sort of fixed. We kind of live as if we're not going to, as if we're going to live forever. It's often only when something like that, something breaks through that delusion, something strong like someone getting ill, a family member getting ill, or someone close to us passing away, where suddenly that sort of default way of interacting with the world sort of breaks down. And we sort of realise that that's not quite how it is. And so Milarepa sort of realises that. He's clinging on to this, his cloth. He's clinging on to his clothes. He's like, he's like, oh God, this is blowing away. And my sticks are falling away. He's holding on to all these onto these things. And he thinks, well, what am I actually holding on to? What am I really clinging on to here? And I think perhaps it's hard for us to sometimes see because it's so easy to sort of get things that we want, or we sort of build a world around them. We get sort of used to the things we have. It's quite hard for us to see what it is that we're clinging on to. Yeah, I think it's quite good. Like one example I think of, Milarepa still clinging onto this cloth. He's really clinging onto this piece of garment. He doesn't want it to blow away, and he's clinging to it. And so you think it's just a piece of cloth, but when you're sort of in solitude, I guess, and he hasn't got anything else. He has a few books at this point. He's got a pot for cooking nettles in. But when you haven't got anything else, those things that you do have become really sort of, you really hold on to them. So I've told this story before at class, and at a time that I was doing a solitary retreat. I was doing a solitary retreat, and I was reading the stories of Milarepa as well at the time, actually. And so on solitary retreat, it's a bit more luxurious than Milarepa's cave. You've got central heating, a fridge. I bought some pizzas to cook, to have, and I also made an apple crumble at one point. But it's basically the same as meditating in a cave. So on solitary retreat, you don't have much. You have your clothes, and I took my books that I was going to read. And suddenly the things that you do have become really kind of like, I don't know, important. The main thing that comes important, and what people often that I've shared with and share the same sort of experiences, is food becomes like really important. And you think it really like is a big deal, like the food that you've got, because it's sort of the only sort of thing you've got, the only real like delight. The rest of the time you're sort of meditating with your mind, very simple conditions. And I was on this solitary retreat, and I ran out of what I started really going for was strawberry jam. So I was sort of having jam on everything: jam on oat cake, jam on rice cake, jam on everything, jam on crumpet, important. And I ran out of jam because I was going through it at such a fast pace, and I left a note for the people who were looking after me. So you sort of leave a note for people to like restock you if you run out of anything. So I left this note, and I said on the note a few things, and also strawberry jam. Went back, so the next day I go back to the point where they leave the food, and there's no strawberry jam. There's other things, there's onions, there's tomatoes, but there's no strawberry jam. And so Milarepa would go, oh, what am I really clinging on to here? But what I did was go into a complete story about how it was like, how could they forget my jam? They've done this on purpose. I knew the person who was looking after me, and I spent the whole day just proliferating about he's done this on purpose. He knows that, that's the one thing I was enjoying. He's trying to make it harder for me. Sounds really silly now, and I laugh about it now. At the time, it wasn't funny. But what it showed to me in hindsight is that, like, okay, so when other things aren't there, so I really do cling to something. I really want to cling to something. I really want to cling to something. The only thing I had really was food, and I really cling to it, and it was really painful when it was sort of taken away. And so we sort of cling to, there's all sorts of things that we sort of cling to and want to call me or mine, and that's what the cloth really represents in this. So what happens is also, so we got to this point where Milarepa is, he's passed out from the storm, from lack of energy. When he comes to, he sort of sees the cloth dangling sort of helplessly in this tree, and he's sort of like up high, and he gazes at it and he sees it, and he sort of thinks how suddenly the cloth represents all these worldly possessions and ties and relations and status and wealth, all these things that we sort of cling to and identify with and sort of build up an identity around. So, I mean, that maybe was an example of a possession, and maybe it's a bit of a silly one, the food, but it can also be other precious things. Maybe there are possessions that we hold on to, but another one might be something like status, and or as a sort of an idea of ourselves. And one thing I've sort of Well, maybe I'll stop there. Actually, maybe I'll ask. So, what other? So that's an example of like a possession, something that Okay, in that case, it was food, and day to day when I'm in London, I don't lose it over a jam, but then maybe there is some sort of something that if definitely like I'm a musician, and when I come into my practice room at school when I teach, and someone's picked up my instrument, I definitely give them. I sort of get a bit angry, I'm quite attached to it, or like hold it quite dear. I wonder if there's other things that, so I thought about possessions, but what about other things we identify with? What other things do we identify with? Nadia, sorry. Go on, Nadia.
Stories about ourselves.
Oh yeah, stories. So we sort of cling to sort of like,
or like stories. I was just reflecting recently, just at work, we were talking about what we wanted to do when we grew up, and my dad told me stories about me that I realised in the back of my head I still cling to, like positive stories.
Yeah.
But it's really like framed like how I approach life.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In a positive way? Or?
Yeah. Should I say what it is?
Well, I don't. You don't have to. But maybe that's enough to go on that. I think maybe people were sort of relating to that, like. Also, so it could be a positive thing, but also it's like clinging to an idea of yourself, or having an idea of yourself, or a story about how what you're like or what you're going to be. I definitely have that story of sort of, for me, like sort of being a musician, or like being this artist. I sort of say I started adopting this story or sort of identity of being this struggling artist, And some, you can picture it, can't you? Like slaving over music, like practicing all the time, and it shaped how I started to live. And it's like, even though, and it's funny, those sort of stories that we want to outlive or live out, or ideas of ourselves that we live out. That one was like, there was like an element of pain in the story. Like, I'm going to create beautiful art, but it's going to be really hard getting there. Like that kind of story. But weirdly, like. So when I was sort of feeling the pain of it, it's like, at least the story or that idea of myself that I wanted was somehow being satisfied. So we can have like negative stories about ourselves, can't we? So it can be like something negative, and we can still cling to it because it gives us a sense of me, sense of I am the struggling artist. Thanks, Nadia. Any more? So the stories, possessions. Yeah, Jay-Z?
I think you've already mentioned it, but identity, I think we cling on to.
Yeah.
We always say that we're like this, we're never going to do that, that's not me. But that's kind of just sort of closes you up to everything else.
Yeah, we can sort of, we sort of want to build up an identity, and that could be around possessions and things. It could also be about sort of status as well, can't it? Sort of like, sort of being, being seen to, identity is a bit like what Akasha Mitra was talking about in the first half, about comparison. So I feel like identity is also one step away from then comparing your identity with how you see other people. That's the thing that really this. One thing I sort of want to highlight maybe is what this sort of idea of bringing up this idea of a separate self, or of a fixed identity of ourselves, an idea of ourselves that we build up, leads to comparison, comparing ourselves with other people. And a bit like what Akasha Mitra was saying, you can there's different ways of comparing. You can either compare and think you're better than them, you compare and think you're worse, or you compare and think you're the same. And that was really good. It's sort of like one of those things to think about, that none of them are real, or none of them really are in line with reality. I think we can build up different identities. One, what I just mentioned, I'm a musician. One identity that I sort of give as an example that I sort of have built up in my life, or when I studied music when I was younger, as a sort of a teenager, and then did as a degree. So I studied music, and someone said to us, this was the this was the sort of mental health guidance that we got when we started music college. Sometimes you'll feel like you are on top of the world and the best thing ever, and sometimes you will feel like the worst thing ever. And that's just how it is. I remember just being told that on my first day at music college, and it was really true. But it wasn't particularly helpful in the end, but it was very true, because it's a arena where it's just so much room for comparison. It's very competitive. You're sort of doing something together, you're studying together, but at the end of the day, there's only one part in the performance, that you're all going for, so it's a constant comparison, and you can either feel like if you feel like you're better, you can get this very inflated kind of confidence, and you get this very inflated confidence, that feeling of you are on top of the world. But then as soon as you compare yourself and in your eyes, you're not as good at something or someone, then it's like that inflated idea of yourself and just get burst and go straight back down. And you can feel right at the bottom. That's definitely my experience of studying. I think a lot of people, I know Rowan, you study music, and yourself, well, 3 musicians at the back, that kind of world. But we can do that with anything. I think there's all sorts of things nowadays where it sort of breeds comparison, like social media. I'm off social media now, but it always seemed to be like, well, for musicians, like, look at this amazing gig I'm doing. It's like, oh, everyone's doing these amazing gigs. No one ever puts up like, I don't know, I'm watching Netflix and I didn't get up until 12 o'clock. Or, you want to put up your sort of best idea. People put up their best idea of themselves, and then it breeds comparison. I think one thing about comparison, way around it, is sort of accepting, a sort of self-acceptance, and sort of accepting the shape that we are. I remember talking to one of my teachers. One of the worries that I had at college, one of the worries is also that at music college you want to be like I was studying jazz, and you want to be like an individual. But that doesn't actually mean being an individual. It just means you want to be different from everyone else. Just different from being yourself. But you want to be different from everyone else. And I remember learning, one of the practices you do is you can learn other players' solos. So you can learn them and you learn from it. I remember saying to one of my teachers, but I don't want to sound like them. Like, I don't want to sound like a copy of them. And he's like, there's no way you could. If you like, it's like, don't worry about it, you won't, because, it was sort of reassuring. It was like, there's no way that you could sound or be like somebody else, exactly like that. One image which is sort of very common in Buddhism is sort of an image of like plants or growth or sort of nature. And one image is like the lotus, and there's lotuses here. And there's also like quite a common image that you might have heard from, the sort of famously like the Buddha's vision when he gained enlightenment was seeing humanity as lotuses in different forms of development. So the sort of like plant image. And I think what we can do, it's important to think of, is we can see ourselves all as a sort of the same plant and sort of competing against each other to try and grow. But, I think one reflection I like on that image is that, an apple tree, for instance, can't grow into a lotus, or can't grow into an oak tree. And with comparison, it's like we think we're all the same person, we're all the same shape, and then sort of comparing ourselves and almost competing in an unhealthy way. And I think it's one part of getting away from that is sort of starting to accept and see what kind of shape we are, and sort of understanding what shape we are, what kind of thing we're going to grow into, and comparing ourselves with someone who is a completely different shape to us won't necessarily really help us to grow in that way. Okay. So that's something, I think, of what Milarepa sees in that cloth. And I'll go on because we're running out of time. There's just one more bit I want to talk about. So Milarepa's fainted, he's passed out, and then he's awoken to see the cloth in the tree, and it sort of shows him that he sees it as all of his worldly possessions, all of his identities, worldly identities, status, and things that he's clinging to, which ultimately is futile because it's sort of bumping up against the reality of how things are. And what he then sees, he looks down into the valley from where he's up, and he thinks of his teacher. And he's filled with loneliness, a feeling of loneliness, and he looks down, and he can imagine that at this time his teacher will be studying and teaching with his brothers, who he studies and practices Dharma with. And he starts to miss them, and he sings a song of longing. So this is one of the songs he bursts into, and he sings a song of longing to be with his guru, to be with his teacher. And he wants to be guided. He sort of wants to be taught. He wants some guidance, and he wants his companions. And his teacher appears to him in a sort of vision. So he's sort of there are clouds sort of filling the valley below where he's below where he is, and his teacher sort of appears out of these clouds. And he speaks to him and sort of gives him reassurance, sort of like encourages him in the practice he's doing. And sort of, so he's filled with resolve, but also he leaves him saying, he leaves him saying that also they're never parted, they're never apart, even though they might be away, physically distant from each other, that his teacher, he's always with him. And they're never separated. And that's the last thing he says after he gives this sort of rousing thing. Just remember that we're never separated. And that can seem like from my own experience of being on solitary retreat, one thing that can come up is loneliness. I'm quite an extrovert, so when I go and just be on my own and don't see anyone or speak to anyone for a couple of weeks, one thing that comes up for me definitely is loneliness. I just want to talk to people. Sometimes I crack really funny jokes, and then I'm like, I wish someone was around to hear that. It's like, it can be really funny on solitary retreats. But one thing is loneliness, but also, actually, and what's been and I think what other people have shared with me as well, and what I've experienced, is actually I can feel incredibly connected to people on actually a much deeper level than if I was with them physically. And how would I explain that? That's been my experience, and how I'd explain that is when you are not with someone, for instance, like family, say like my parents or something, it's like when I'm not with them, they sort of exist in this really sort of pure way of what they mean to me, on a much deeper level, what my parents mean to me, what I'm grateful to them for, how how much I love them and things like that, so on a much deeper level. Then when I'm with them in person, it's just really mundane. It can just be, so I can be with, thinking of them on such a, I just want to see how my mum's doing, or I want to see my teacher at the Buddhist centre. And then you get there and they're like, oh, put the kettle on. Mm-hmm. Then I start getting a little bit irritated with how they're doing something. So in solitude and what it's like for Milarepa, he can start to experience his guru on a much sort of more purer, a deeper level. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's something about loneliness, and we don't. There's sort of physical loneliness, and not seeing people in person, but yeah, in this case, sort of Milarepa and his teacher reminds him that even though we're not physically there, we're still together. We're not separated. And actually, throughout all the stories, so this is the first story. Throughout all the stories, every story and every song, even that Milarepa sings, begins with recalling his guru and sort of giving homage to his guru and bringing him to mind and giving thanks and gratitude to his guru. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's all I'm going to talk about there. So I'm going to finish off this little part of the story. So we started with Milarepa in this cave, going to get sticks, struggling with the wind. I didn't talk about the wind. The wind's an important part. Maybe Akasha Mitra will talk about the wind next time. The wind. He's struggling against the wind, holding onto his clubs, holding onto these sticks. He sees this. That becomes an image of him. His sort of diligent mindfulness, this practice of diligent mindfulness, realizes that it's not that he sort of sees this as a sort of reality sort of showing itself to him, his sort of ego clinging and how he's bumping up against how things are in reality. He sees that and he lets go and he falls into a faint. As he comes to, he sees his cloth dangling in the trees, and he sings for his. He's filled with loneliness. Sings to his guru, or a song of longing, and his guru appears and reassures him and feels him resolved to go back to his meditation. So he goes back to his cave, and to his surprise, there are beings waiting for him there. He finds that his cave has been infested with demons. Oh, so his cave has been infested with demons, and that's where we're going to leave Milarepa for tonight, and that's where Akasha Mitra is going to take up. Okay, so take up next week. Okay, so that's a little bit about, hopefully a little introduction to Milarepa. And this is the first, actually I think this might even be just the first page of the 100,000 songs of Milarepa, this big book. So this is the page 1 of the 100,000 songs. But a few weeks ago I was here talking about mantra and the importance of mantra and how, so you might have done quite a bit of mantra chanting before, and each figure, maybe it's the Buddha or a figure on the shrine like Milarepa, can appear to us in a physical form, but also in a sound form, like a mantra. And a mantra is also sort of thought of as like an invocation, like you invoke that figure. It can be thought of like a spell. Sometimes it's translated as a spell or magic words or a magic utterance, which invokes and brings into the room and brings into our experience that figure. And so sort of following on from what Milarepa doing, longing for his guru, we're going to sort of finish by chanting a mantra of Milarepa, sort of to mark the start of this series, sort of trying to invoke and bring to mind Milarepa. So how we'll chant the mantra, if you've not chanted mantra before, I'd encourage you just to join in. Mantras don't really, there's not like a literal meaning, like a translatable meaning. A lot of it's just sort of sound syllables, sort of syllables which can't be translated. So I encourage you to join in. How I like to chant mantra is rather than, we might have done them to a melody before, but what I like to do is sort of chant them sort of each syllable or word quite long, and we do it just with the out breath. So we'll all sort of breathe in together, and for as long as our out breath lasts, we just chant that syllable or the word. Okay, so this mantra, the words are, the mantra for Milarepa is Om Guru Hasa Vajra Hum. Okay, Om Guru Hasa Vajra Hum. Okay. What we'll do is I'll go through it once, okay, one time through the whole mantra, just breathing in and breathing, and then I'm doing it on the exhale, and you'll pick it up. Just join in. Okay, so let's set up in meditation posture, and we'll chant the mantra. So take a few moments just to sit. I'll chant through the mantra one time, and then we can all join in. Just sit for a moment. Okay, so that concludes our evening. So if you're interested in what could be a good bit of reading while we're doing this series, is to read that book, The Yogi's Joy. Like I say, it can be quite a thing to get into 100,000 songs straight away. It takes a bit of getting used to. But The Yogi's Joy is sort of a commentary on that, and it's a really brilliant book and a really brilliant way of bringing the whole world of Milarepa, which we're going to be exploring alive. So I really recommend that book. Okay, so we'll leave it there. If you can put your mats and cushions to the side.
Thank you.